All right. Well, we'll try to get this started. Um, you got the B team tonight, at least with me. So I understand Mark's celebrating with his father, 90th birthday, 90th birthday. So if you were expecting something else, I'm sorry, but it's me for about 30 minutes or so, and then Kent's going to take over. I really can't take credit for putting a lot of this together. Kent had worked up a a talk at one time, and so I borrowed very heavily from a lot of stuff he had, and then I added a few things of my own. But bottom line is, we wanted to try to talk a little bit about what we titled "Modern Genetics in the Bible," and sort of look at some interesting, I think, areas where we can use genetics, we can use biology, we can use the sciences to understand a little bit more about the Bible. And so this first slide is sort of an introduction to that. And basically, we're saying that one of the things you do have to accept is that there's some differences in the way in which these two areas approach what is truth. Science, including genetics, is an experimental science. Whereas history studies one-off events, things that have happened in the past, which you can't recreate. I mean, there's always going to be differences. You might be able to recreate the temperatures or the wind or whatever, but the people are different. There's always going to be these differences. History is a one-off event, and so the way you learn about it, the way you try to understand it, is you read about it, you dig up artifacts, and you try to interpret what those artifacts mean, and that's history. Science, on the other hand, believes in the idea that you can investigate something, you can predict what's going to happen, and you can set up experiments to actually test that. So history is not experimental. You can't do the experiment again. The people don't exist anymore. The environment has changed, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas science attempts to use empirical methods to test whatever you're trying to learn about, whatever you're trying to determine. So keep that in mind as we go through this, is that we're looking at things from two different aspects. So what is science a little bit? Well, one thing is it's iterative. It builds one on the other. Some of you may have heard the quote by Newton that the reason I have been able to see further is that I have stood on the shoulders of giants. So in other words, there was all of these things that had been done, and yet Newton took that information and carried it forward. It's true of all of the sciences that basically there's been a lot of work done by a lot of different people. And although somebody may get a Nobel Prize, in reality, the reason they got that Nobel Prize is that there was information available prior to them, and they took that and they carried it a little bit further. However, the difference is, of course, is that God's word is unchanging. We know that from time to time, we'll find new pieces of paper or pieces of papyrus or different bits of information. And I think Kent's going to talk about that a little bit more, that may have a slightly different phrasing, or there may be some different words, or maybe there's a new verse that someone finds. And they say, well, is that, God's inspired word? Is that really, change the meaning of what the Bible is all about? And in reality, to my knowledge, we've never found anything like that that really questions or shakes the bedrock of God's word. So I gave an example here of a very recent discovery that was made of what's called a pamblufsit. I can't pronounce it. I even looked it up and tried to get it right. But these are basically the fact that some of those manuscripts that were produced on animal skins and so forth were so valuable that literally people would write something, they might keep it for 10 years, 20 years, 50 years. And then because it was so valuable, they would literally scrape off the old writing and write over it. Okay. And that might happen 2 or 3 times. Well, imagine trying to read what's underneath that. And literally, we can do it. We now have various methods that will allow us to read down through those layers. And of course, Kent's going to talk about some of the problems when those things fall apart. So now you've got a jigsaw puzzle, and now you're trying to read 2 or 3 levels down. So the bottom line is that one example recently was that they found portions of the book of Jeremiah, and there's a little different phrasing from what we see in our Bible today. There's a little different wording. However, there's nothing, earth shaking in terms of the meaning and so forth. Science, on the other hand, there can be some earth shaking changes. There, we can change our theories. We can decide that what we believed at one point is no longer true. At one point, we believed that the planets and the sun revolved around the earth. Well, after some work, we figured out that that wasn't true. And so we changed what we believe. It's quite common. We're going to get into genetics. And so there was a lot of thoughts about what and how genetics worked prior to where we're at today. There was a theory, for instance, that the sperm from the male contained all of the future generations that would come from the embryo that was created with that. In other words, there were tiny little animalcules within each sperm cell, and that would produce all of the generations to come. Not true, okay? But people did not have the technologies that we have today. So we changed as new findings came along. So theories are frequently modified to accommodate or explain new data, but we need to be careful that as some of these new theories, some of these new discoveries and so forth come out, that we don't let it shake our bedrock belief, our bedrock faith in what God teaches. It's easy sometimes to go off the deep end. Some new discovery is made, some new comment is put out there, and suddenly what does that mean? Has that changed what we really believe about what God says? So we have to be careful. We have to take our time. We have to work through those things. And I gave an example there of misinterpretation of the Bible as new sciences come out may make one question their faith. And so Galileo was convicted as a heretic because he believed that the sun, everything revolved around the sun. And so that was not the prevailing theory at the time. So genetics, I used to teach biology, and so I apologize if this kind of becomes a biology class and, not, but bear with me for a minute, because I know a lot of you heard all this stuff in some cases a few years ago, maybe more recently for some of you. And, it might have been fuzzy then, and it might have even changed a little bit since you last heard it. But a lot of you are familiar with a guy named Mendel, back in the 1860s. And so Mendel was a monk, the father of genetics. I always thought that was kind of interesting. The father of genetics was a monk. Okay. So he never married, never had children of his own. But he worked with these garden peas. He came up with the idea that there were discrete units of inheritance. Now, he didn't call them genes. He didn't know anything about DNA, but there was something within those peas, those garden peas, that was being transferred from one generation to the next. And it was accounting for different colors, different sizes, whether the peas were wrinkled or smooth, et cetera, et cetera. So a very important step in all of this. Some of these other guys you may not be as familiar with. Individual by the name of Morgan, who around the turn of the 19th century discovered that these genes, these discrete units of inheritance, were found on the chromosomes. It had taken a long time to even determine that there were these things called chromosomes within our cells. You probably heard of Watson and Crick, but just as importantly was a lady by the name of Rosalind Franklin. And the three of them really are responsible for being able to determine that it was DNA by looking at DNA, literally by the X-ray crystallography that Rosalind Franklin had produced. They were able to determine that it was DNA that was the chemical that was passing information from one generation to the next. It was the code, in other words, of life. And Watson and Crick got the Nobel Prize, I think it was in 68 or something like 62. Rosalind Franklin died in 1958. They published their paper in 1953. So this came out literally in about a 2-page little paper. And there's a little aside at the very end that says, it has not escaped our notice that the structure that we see here might be used for the language of genetics. It was kind of an understated way of saying it. It's like, hey, we just solved what it is that codes for all of these genes, all of these different traits that we have. And unfortunately, Rosalind Franklin did not get the acclaim or acknowledgments and so forth that perhaps she would have had she lived. There's a guy by the name of Sanger in the mid-70s that was able to actually begin reading each one of those letters of the code. And so you may have heard people talk about AGCT. These are particular compounds that code for the information that then makes us. Mullis produced the PCR assay. So if you watch crime shows, you've heard about, they find hair someplace and they take that hair and they isolate the DNA from it. And, on TV, it takes about 30 minutes and they've got the answer. They know who did it. Takes a little longer than that, but it's gotten much better than it used to be. Fortunately, when I was doing my postdoc, I was trying to sequence these particular proteins, or sequence the genes that made those proteins. And I spent a couple of months doing that. So it's moved a lot from where we were then. By 2003, they had completed what was called a human genome project. And then as recently as 2022, we've kind of refined that. We've determined that there are about 3.2 billion nucleotide pairs. So that's times 2, that's 6.4 billion of those AGCs and Ts in every one of the cells of your body, with the exception of the red blood cells and the sex cells. But all of your body cells, the cells lining the cheeks of your skin, the inside of your mouth and so forth, 6.4 billion nucleotides, 3.2 billion pairs, and those in turn code for about 20,000 or so different genes. So hair color, eye color, whether or not you can flex a muscle simply because do you have the right protein that will do that. So we know a lot more about what's going on than we did, and I'm taking a long time. So what we decided to do was we would talk about some of the areas in which the ways in which we can use this knowledge, this science, to apply it to some of the things that we know from the Bible. And so I'm going to talk about the first two, and hopefully I'll leave a little bit of time for Kent to get to the last couple of ones. So human cells contain these 46 chromosomes, 23 pairs of those. 22 of those pairs are pretty much, they look alike. In other words, they're homologous. There's this one pair, however, that are sex chromosomes. There's an X chromosome and there's a Y chromosome if you're male, and there's two X's if you're female. The homologous chromosomes code for things like physical traits, structural proteins, the enzymes that do all the work within the body. And then those sex chromosomes, again, are responsible for the traits that make us either male or female. So here's a picture. You may have seen this at some time. It's called a karyotype. It's what it's what a doctor would do if they were trying to diagnose whether or not an individual might have some sort of genetic disease. You may have, Down syndrome is a pretty good example here. You can look at the 21st chromosome. That 21st pair up there, there's only two, okay? However, in an individual who has Down syndrome, there are three of those, and that accounts for the difficulties that they have. So there's the XX. In other words, those are homologous with each other. However, in the male, it's XY. And those chromosomes and that DNA, in other words, are all found within the nucleus of the cell. So all of that to finally get to something about the Bible. Okay. I just told you to be male, you have to inherit a Y chromosome. Well, what about if you have to inherit a Y chromosome from your father, because they're the only ones who have Y chromosomes, then could you track that back to that first human male? In other words, Adam must have produced a Y chromosome that was then transferred to his son and to his son and to his son and to all males who are now on Earth. So using that as kind of the hypothesis, they analyzed the Y chromosomes from a group of 69 men. And these individuals were selected from 9 different parts of the world. So, just imagine all different kinds of races, different geographic areas, etc. And by estimating the rate at which the DNA was mutating or changing with time, they were able to work back and estimate that a common ancestor, what is now referred to as the Y chromosome Adam, was alive between a period of about 120 to 150,000 years ago. Now, we'll talk more about times and so forth a little bit later, but bottom line is that if all of the males alive today originate from an individual, again, the idea was to be able to track that back. And this is what they were able to find, is that all living males today do apparently track back to a single individual. Let's take a look at the other side of the coin. In this case, we're not going to look at the nuclear DNA, in other words, those chromosomes, but it turns out that there's another source of DNA within each cell. All of us have those chromosomes, okay? And that accounts for about 98% of the DNA that's found in our body. And that codes for, eye color and all of the, your height, et cetera, et cetera. But it turns out that there's some DNA also that is found in what are called mitochondria. And maybe you've heard of those guys or not, but mitochondria are, we used to put it on, my high school biology classes, we'd say the mitochondria are the energy factories of the cell. They're the ones that are churning out energy. Now you can make energy other ways, but it's not nearly as efficient because the mitochondria utilize uh, oxygen, aerobic respiration. Uh, the fact is that you've experienced the reason we're walking around today is because aerobic respiration. You may experience anaerobic respiration. What happens if you take a weight and you pick it up 15 times in a row? Muscle gets a little achy, right? It's because you've used up all the oxygen that was available to those muscle cells, but they don't just quit, at least not initially. They can use a different method of producing energy, but it's not nearly as efficient. It doesn't produce as much energy, and it gives off a byproduct called lactate, and it makes your muscle hurt. And you'll really feel it the next day because that lactate takes a while to break down. So the mitochondria are found in every cell of the body, egg cells, sperm cells, and all the cells within the body. And they're producing energy so that those cells can do their work. Now, the DNA that's found in the mitochondria is a very small amount. Those chromosomes are the DNA that's found in mitochondria is only composed of about 16,000 base pairs. Remember, we said there were 3.2 billion nucleotides pairs in the chromosomes, okay? And these are only 16,000. So this is a very small amount of information. It's just enough information for those guys to be able to produce the energy that we all rely on. And they only code for about 37 genes. Remember, we said 20,000 genes or so that the rest of the body produces. Both the sperm and the egg have mitochondria. However, when the sperm fertilizes the egg, none of the mitochondria from the father enter the mother. Okay? Think about that for a minute. None of the mitochondria from the sperm enter the mother. So every one of you in here have mitochondria that you inherited from your mother, not your father, just your mother. Guess what? Your mother, the mitochondria she had, was all inherited from her mother and her mother and her mother. So wait a minute, maybe we could use this information to go back and see if there is a mitochondrial Eve, that first woman, or that woman who possessed the mitochondria that gave rise to everyone else. So this is kind of a cross section of what the mitochondria looks like under very high magnification. And so there have been several papers out that have worked on this particular question. It's called mitochondrial Eve. Since all the mitochondria are inherited from the mother, then all mitochondria existing in humans must have originated from a common ancestor, an original ancestor. Now, the study that was done was they took 147 individuals, male and female, from all parts of the world, 5 different areas of the world, and they began to look at the non-coding region of the mitochondrial DNA. So the part that doesn't code for that energy production. In other words, there are parts that are, space fillers, if you will. And those particular areas, they found that there were mutations in those, and they were able to track those back. And again, they were able to estimate an age. The paper gave originally a time of about that there was this mitochondrial Eve, something like 170,000 years ago. More recently, they've done some other studies. They've tried to refine this and so forth, and they've come up with a number of about 120 to 150,000 years ago. I'm sorry, 98 to 140,000, which if you think about it, that falls sort of in that range of the Y chromosome Adam, they're estimating at about 120 to 150. So there's an overlap. So what does this all come down to? Well, I think the first thing, and it's really the point I want you to carry away, is that this data supports the biblical account that there were two individuals who literally are responsible for everybody who's alive today. Okay. There was Adam and there was Eve. There were the two people, and we have genetic information that says that we all originate from two individuals. Now, the time frame may bother a lot of people. We're talking, 100, 150,000 years ago by the estimates that they are using. And so it doesn't support the idea of a young Earth. And that may bother you, it may not. But again, take away what I said in the first point. In addition, just to kind of clarify a little bit, I don't want everybody to come out here and say, well, the scientists have agreed with everything we've said. Well, most scientists are hesitant to use this terminology of Adam and Eve, and particularly to use it in the way in which we use it within the church, because they put forward that Eve was not the only woman alive at that time, nor was Adam the only person alive at that time. What they're saying is that there was a woman and a group, and that particular woman is the only one who actually, all of her offspring survived through all of those generations. Okay, think about it. There may have been this other person that had mitochondria that were being passed down for 100 generations. And then guess what? She didn't have a daughter. Okay. And thus her lineage died out. But there was that one person whose lineage has continued on to today. And the same way with Adam. Similarly, they don't believe that Adam was necessarily the only male who was alive at that particular time. And they don't even necessarily believe that the two were members of the same group. So they may have been totally separate, at least from a scientific standpoint. Keep in mind the differences in science and the Bible. Difference in science is you've got to be able to prove it. You have to have data to demonstrate this. We have faith, okay? So the data is not there to be able to show that Adam and Eve lived as husband and wife. They can't nail it down that tightly. But again, that first point that I made is that it supports two individuals who are responsible for everybody who's alive today. And as I said at the end, what I've told you does not necessarily contradict anything that we've been talking about here within the church. Hesitate to say any questions, but damn, we got. All right. Well, I'll try to do better. I'll try to get through with this and get yeah. All right. So real quickly, it's already 7. Okay. So as most of you are familiar with, the Levitical laws and so forth put forward that or state that the priest could only come from one particular tribe of the Israelites, and that was the tribe of Levi. So there we have the information and so forth. We can look at the verses. It talks about that all of the Kohen or the Jewish priesthood should come from that particular tribe. Now, there are some exceptions to it. Melchizedek, Christ was a priest, but those were exceptions. The priesthood was passed from Aaron to his sons, and then to their sons and their sons and their sons. There are Jews still alive today who claim to be Levitical priest. Okay. And so if that's true, they should be able to trace their lineages back all the way to Aaron. The Levitical priest, also called Cohens or Kohanim, have many special responsibilities. One of those responsibilities is they should remain undefiled and maintain the lineage that they have gained from Aaron. Now, to maintain that lineage, then that would mean that they would need to make sure that they followed all of the necessary prescriptions on being a priest. And so as we go through this, we'll talk about it a little bit more. There was an individual by the name of Carl Skorecki, and again, I'm dependent here on Kent for having located this information originally. He is an MD. He works on a lot of different areas, pretty well known in the area of kidney diseases and so forth. And he it also happens to be a Jewish Cohen. He's a Jewish priest and claims his lineage all the way back to Aaron. Now, he was sitting in church like we do, and maybe his mind wandered a little bit. Mine does occasionally. I'm sure that doesn't happen to you, but he was observing the individual who was reading the Torah that day, and he was a Sephardic Jew. That refers to someone whose origins go back to Spain and Portugal, the Iberian Peninsula. And around 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella, you may have heard of those guys, they proclaimed that all Jews should be exiled from the Iberian Peninsula. So they were all forced out. And so they're called Sephardic Jews today. Now they also claimed to hold the lineage from Aaron and to be Kohanim. The fact, though, was as he looked at this man, he realized, I don't look anything like him. Okay. We don't seem to resemble each other very much. And so how could we be related? How could we be related? So they should, if they're all descended from a common ancestor, they should have some genetic markers that would tie them one to another. And so this is referred to as, these genetic markers are called a haplotype. And so by going in and looking at those chromosomes, by using all that technology that I talked about earlier, like PCR and all that kind of stuff, they've actually been able to sequence all that information, and they've been able to read out those codes. And so they've identified certain areas on certain chromosomes that allow them to understand that this particular individual is related to this one. And so most of the Y chromosome, except for a little section that is responsible for maleness, if you will, is non-coding DNA. It's DNA that doesn't produce any particular proteins or doesn't code for any proteins that might give you eye color or something like that. This non-coding DNA will accumulate mutations, but these are non-detrimental. So the person doesn't have any ill effects from it. They don't die or anything like that. And so by looking at these mutations, these neutral mutations, they can get some idea about, again, age. They can get some idea about time. And but looking at these mutations or these haplotypes, they can tell something about the ancestry of the individual, the relationships that individuals have with one another. And so, there we go. So Skorecki, that we were talking about, in collaboration with another geneticist, collected cheek swabs from 188 Jewish males. And these people were from different locations. And some were Cohens, some were just Levites, and then some were from Israel and so forth. They identified a specific haplotype, a specific signature, if you will, within the chromosome, within the Y chromosome, that they could use to identify individuals who were related. And turns out that 98.5% of all living Jewish priests today, the Kohanim, 98.5% of them are actually related in that sense. In other words, they're all descended from a common ancestor. You're going to assume that was Aaron, right? A second study looked at chromosomal markers, and this is one of these haplotypes we were talking about. We won't go into details, but they found that 97 out of 106 of these individuals, these are randomly picked, rabbis out there. And they found that, only the odds of them all having the same genetic marker is only like 1 in 10,000 or something. They've done a lot more work on this over the years, and they found that the mutation rates and so forth suggest that common ancestor lived approximately 3,300 years ago, which fits fairly nicely with the time frame in which we estimate that Aaron was alive. In Exodus, and actually there's several other verses, but in Exodus, it mentions, it shall be for them an appointment to an everlasting priesthood throughout their generations. In other words, they were to maintain that purity, that lineage all the way. And they've done a pretty good job of it. So I've carried on too long, Kent, but I think it's yours.
Well, I started talking about this about 12 years ago. I did a similar series. And when Mark called me and said, can you do something? I thought of that. And then I thought, I really need somebody who knows biology better than I do. I'm a biochemist, but I started as a chemist. And Vic started as a biologist before he became an immunologist. So he knows the biology better than I do. And there's a lot of genetics in immunology. So you want to talk about protein structures? I'm your man. Okay. One of the other questions that comes out is, where do these Samaritans come from? They're mentioned in the Bible. They're not really mentioned much in the Old Testament. And then in the New Testament, bang, here's these Samaritans. And they were bad people. Well, not totally. Anyway, they appear rather suddenly. And my Hebrew didn't show up very well, but that's okay. You probably didn't care anyway. But the first place they're met is they want to help the returning Israelites, the Jews, who come back from Babylonian captivity to rebuild the temple. And the Jews say, no, we don't want you to. In Ezra 4, verse 3 down there, you got Zerubbabel and Yeshua. That's same word as Jesus, but obviously it's not Jesus Christ. And the rest of the heads of the fathers' houses in Israel said to them, you have nothing to do with us in building a house to our God. But we alone will build to the Lord, the God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, has commanded us. And they turned down these people who were living in the land at the time. And you notice it goes back to, we have been sacrificing to God ever since the days of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, who brought us here. That means they were brought there at the time of the destruction of the northern kingdom by the Assyrians. Okay, so that's what the Old Testament says. Now, if you ask Samaritans what their history is, they have a story. And they say that Uzi was a good priest. He was a descendant of Aaron, Eleazar, and Phinehas, and he practiced on Mount Gerizim, which is, if you've heard about Nablus in the West Bank, that's a city on the West Bank of Israel. And there's been a lot of violence there through the years. But that's between Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. So that's where we're talking about. But they built a temple on Mount Gerizim, and Uzi was practicing being a priest on Mount Gerizim before the temple was built. Meanwhile, Eli was a descendant of Ithamar, and he wanted to be a priest, according to the Samaritans. You all remember Eli? The guy had the two terrible sons, and he raised Samuel, and he didn't hear it when God called Samuel. So in 1 Chronicles 6:1, it says the sons of Levi are Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. The sons of Kohath, Amram, that's Moses and Aaron's dad, Izhar, Hebron, and Uziel. The children of Amram, Aaron, Moses, and Miriam, those three people you've heard of. The sons of Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, of course, were killed suddenly, Eleazar and Ithamar. And Eleazar fathered Phinehas, Phinehas fathered Abishua, and Abishua fathered Buki, and Buki fathered Uzi. Now, Phinehas was the priest about the time that we start into Joshua and Judges, okay? So it turns out that most of the Samaritans who still live, there's still about 200 people who claim to be Samaritans living in that region. And so they're highly inbred. You can imagine if you only had 200 people to choose from, and probably only about 20% of those are the age that you might want to be. Okay. At one time, they were down to just 4 families in the 19 teens, but they are much more closely related by their Y chromosome to Jews than their Palestinian neighbors. Now, the women, the mitochondrial DNA, looks a lot like the Palestinians. So what you're seeing here is the Samaritan men married women from the area, but if they stayed in the sect, in the Samaritans, usually it was because the guy was truly a Samaritan. So we don't have a lot of intermixing of the men, but we do have a lot of women coming into the system. So anyway, if you look at the Y chromosomes for the Samaritans, it says that it looks like the evidence says they separated from the Jews. They have the same Y chromosome characteristics as most Jews. And you can trace that back to about 400 to 700 BC. And so you just start thinking about what happened between 700 BC and 400 BC. 721, 722, somewhere in there, the northern kingdom was wiped out by the Assyrians. And the Assyrians were noted as bringing in captive people from outside the area. They love to shift people around. So, yeah. So they deported all these people to northern Israel. And of course, there were some Israelites who were left. And so they intermarried. Now, what happens in 400 BC? In 400 BC, the Jews who had been in Babylon come back roughly 500 to 400 in that whole region. And what do? They build the temple at Jerusalem. In response, the Samaritans go and build a temple on Gerizim. All right. And this is where you get all this enmity between the Jews and the Samaritans. It gets really worse. The Jews experienced a little bit of independence for about 100 years or so in there. And one of them, the Maccabees, one of the Maccabee descendants, went to Gerizim and looted and burned the temple in Gerizim. So is it any surprise that in the New Testament, the Jews and the Samaritans were not good friends? Okay, but anyway, that's what we know about the Samaritans. And here's a Samaritan priest with his copy of the Samaritan Pentateuch. By the way, the Samaritans only have the first 5 books of the Old Testament in their scriptures. And you think about it, a lot of the prophets were not written when they were taken over. You didn't have Chronicles. You didn't have all the Kings. You didn't have all that, a lot of Psalms. You had Psalms of David maybe, but you didn't have Psalms from later writers. So a lot of that didn't exist. And that's all they've got is 5 books. This is a scroll of the Samaritan Pentateuch. And the script's a little different and all that kind of stuff. Okay. So Vic alluded to the fact that I'm going to talk to you for a minute about the Dead Sea Scrolls. And this came out more recently since I started into looking into these things, because it turns out in the field I'm in, they send stuff to me in my inbox on email. And I started reading that article about Skorecki 25 years ago. And I was just blown away. I said, this is amazing. But it's been done with a lot of different things. But and there's other people groups that we could talk about. But let's skip and look at a different application of genetics. This is taken from Cell. And by the way, Vic and I know that Science and Nature and Cell, these journals, those are like the most important journals for biological research in the world. Okay. When Watson and Crick published about the double helix of DNA, it was in Nature. Cell, a lot of things that have won Nobel Prizes was first published in Cell. And of course, Science is similarly important. But illuminating genetic mysteries of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I would have brought you some pictures from that, but they made a big point about saying this was under copyright, so I didn't. But the Dead Sea Scrolls have done a lot of good things for biblical scholarship, especially of the Old Testament and particularly of the backgrounds to Christianity in the first century. They were discovered in 1947, I believe, by a young shepherd boy who was a teenager, and he was following, I think, a lost sheep or goat, and it got into some caves around the Dead Sea. And so when he went in, he found these pots, clay pots, and they had pieces of scrolls in them. And so eventually, after a while, it became known that he had found these. And of course, the antiquities dealers in Israel went and tried to scoop up a bunch of them before the academics could get out there and look at them. So a lot of them got dispersed, but they went and found these scrolls in a number of caves around this town of Qumran, which was abandoned 2,000 years ago, probably during the Roman invasion. Masada is probably more famous for being invaded by the Romans. That's on the south side of the Dead Sea. Qumran's up there to the north, and just above that's Jericho. So these Dead Sea Scrolls are the oldest copies of the Old Testament that we have. Plus, they have many scrolls that have nothing to do, well, they have nothing to do. They're part of rituals and practices of this sect of Jews and what they did. So it gives us a lot of understanding about what they were doing. Well, obviously, if you've got 2,000-year-old, can you imagine? I was looking at some old Bibles today in preparation for this, and some of my Bibles have aged really well, and some of them have not. Some of them have yellowed considerably. Some of them were written on better paper, and they have yellowed a little through 50, 60 years. But you can see a lot of these scrolls have fallen apart to fragments through the years. So I've got these pieces here. This is not the worst of it. They're trying to piece together what piece that they found in a pot fit where, based upon how it was written, what the paper, it's not paper really, but what the writing material is and what it's talking about. Maybe they could say, well, this is from a particular scripture. And so they tried to piece together these animal skin writings by looking at the handwriting and looking at the content. And they did a lot of great work, but there's still pieces that aren't fitting, especially those tinier ones. And so what these people did, this article was to actually go and see if they could look at the DNA in the writing material and match different pieces of the writing material to each other by their DNA. And this is all, of course, made possible by polymerase chain reaction and Corey Mullis. And I could tell you some stories about Corey Mullis and some of these other guys, but we won't As it turns out, when they looked at this, we had suspected for years that these were mostly sheepskins, but they didn't, you can't really tell by looking whether it's from a sheep or a goat, or maybe even from a cow. So they took this parchment, which basically means an animal skin, and they sequenced it, and most of the scrolls are written on sheepskin. If you remember back in my day, maybe a couple of you guys remember this, if you got a diploma, it was your sheepskin. But anyway, they could then look and see, not only was it from sheep, but they could look and see, was it from the same animal, or was it from a closely related animal? Most of these scrolls are from a sheepskin, and there were a few from other animals. I think there were sheep, goats, and a couple of cows, okay, of the samples that they looked at. But mostly, I think 85 or 90% were sheep. And of course, each animal has distinctive DNA, even within the same species, just like you don't have a twin, or if you do, you might have the same DNA, but most of us don't. So the scrolls really aren't just literary texts, they're also biological artifacts that we can study scientifically. And so if two fragments came from the same sheep, they probably came from the same scroll. And in fact, to make a scroll that's really long, you might have to get 2 sheep or 3 and put them together and put the skins together. So the DNA will match closely if they're closely related. If they're from the same flock, maybe they're genetically similar. Okay, so that allowed them to confirm whether fragments belong to the same original scroll, or maybe they don't belong together. So they looked at what they were actually written on. So they used to look at handwriting and content. Now they've got DNA, and this has allowed them to look at some longstanding debates. And the one of the 3 questions that this paper actually addressed was, there are multiple Jeremiah scrolls in Qumran, a couple of which came from the same cave. Okay. And they wanted to know which fragments went with which scroll from that same cave. You may think, well, it's just 2 copies, it really doesn't matter. Well, actually, those 2 copies of the Jeremiah scroll are slightly different. And this is one of those strange things. You have to look really hard to find this in any Bible. It's in the NIV Study Bible. It's in my Jewish Bible, but it's not in too many of your Bibles. But in Jeremiah 25:13, it talks about, these are the oracles that Jeremiah had against the nations. And then it goes on to other things. And then in chapter 46, the oracles against the nations begin. Now, that's the way it is in the Masoretic text, the traditional Jewish text. In the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible that actually was translated before the Dead Sea Scrolls, or maybe at about the same time they were written. The Septuagint, the Greek translation, has the oracles against the nations right there in chapter 25. So it's like there's this chunk of Jeremiah. It's in both of those manuscripts. It's just that it's moved. Okay. So somebody said it belongs in here. The question is, does it belong here or there? It really doesn't matter. It's in your Bible anyway. It's just where it is. But that was the question. And so where is it? And since the scrolls were found in caves near Qumran, it turns out that some of the scrolls weren't even from local animals. How do we know that? Well, some weren't sheep. They found one scroll that was written on a cowhide. Well, it's written on a cowhide, but they didn't raise any cattle, no cows near Qumran. So it couldn't have come just from Qumran. Maybe it came from Jerusalem. Maybe it came from Gerizim. Who knows where it came from? But it didn't come from Qumran. So they've been able to distinguish that. So it shows that the people who lived in Qumran, even though they seem to have been, hermits, ascetics, had some connection to other people from outside the community. And that's not surprising. We think that the Qumran people who lived in this town and copied the Bible, we believe, they were called Essenes by most people. There was an Essene quarter in Jerusalem. So they might have had contact with a group of people in Jerusalem, as well as this, what would you call it? Not a convent. It's kind of a monastery out there in Qumran, or you could think of it like Shaker Village up in Kentucky. Kibbutz, yeah. There's an English word I was trying to think of, but I'm old. What? They were cloistered, that's for sure. I still can't think of my word, but we don't have time for me to think of it. We're going to move on. We've got synonyms. That'll work. Monastery, yeah. Okay, so anyway, people had thought that most everything that was in Qumran probably had been copied there, but it may be they brought some things from outside. And DNA evidence shows that multiple versions of text, like the book of Jeremiah, circulated at the same time. The DNA indicates that these two Jeremiah scrolls are about the same age. Again, looking at the mutation rates and so forth. So maybe about 250 BC, they had a copy like this, and then a copy like the Septuagint, and a copy like the Masoretic text, and they were there at the same time. And who knows which one was actually written. And probably Jeremiah's scribe wrote a lot of that stuff, and we don't know which one was original. But the scrolls represent that you had the Greek Septuagint kind of likewise, and then this one from the Masoretic text. So the ancient world was more diverse with its text. Also in the Dead Sea Scrolls, you'll find, and this wasn't part of the study, you'll find like 153 Psalms. And so there's 150 in my Bible. There's a few extra that didn't wind up in our Bibles in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay, so what we find, analyzing the animal skins of the Dead Sea Scrolls, researchers showed that most were written on sheep, parchment. You can match the fragments by looking at the animals they came from, and some of the scrolls came from far away. Now, one of the problems, if you go and Google Dead Sea Scroll forgeries, some organizations, I'll not name any, paid millions of dollars for forgeries of Dead Sea Scrolls. And if they just tested the DNA, they probably would have not made that mistake. But it does give us some pause here. Okay. And Vic, I think you did perfectly right, because it's right now about 7:30. Anybody have any questions for either one of us? Mike. On what? On copper. I think there is a copper scroll and there is a silver scroll that people have found that I'm aware of. That does not mean those are the only ones. I'm not sure they were found at the Dead Sea. I'd have to go back and look. But the silver scroll, if I recall correctly, has Deuteronomy 6:4 on it. But in the copper scroll, I'd have to go back and look. But you're right, there are scrolls. And of course, those will age a lot better than a sheepskin probably will. Okay, anything else? You're welcome. It's always fun to talk about science. I tell people I'll be talking about science. If it's science or history, I'll be glad to talk to you anytime. So anyway, if you got any other questions for us, let us know and try to help. Thanks. Thank you very much for coming. We appreciate it.